John Thompson stood in his kitchen on a crisp Monday morning, the kind that promised a clear, bright day. Sunlight streamed through the white lace curtains, casting a warm, comforting glow across the oak table. The air was filled with the familiar, pleasant aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the comforting scent of buttered toast. John moved with practiced efficiency between the toaster and the refrigerator, a routine that usually brought a peaceful start to his day. But this morning, a subtle disquiet settled over him as he glanced at his 6-year-old son, Kevin. Kevin sat slumped in his chair, his khaki shorts rumpled, his normally bright eyes downcast. His cereal bowl remained untouched, the colorful loops slowly turning into a soggy, unappetizing mess in the milk. John noticed Kevin's small fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of his placemat, a new and unsettling habit that had emerged in recent weeks. "Not hungry this morning, sweetheart?" John asked, trying to keep his voice light despite the growing knot of concern in his stomach. Kevin pushed the bowl away with a deliberate slowness that John couldn't ignore. "I don't want to go to school today," he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the soft hum of the refrigerator. John felt a familiar pang of worry. This had become a disturbing pattern. The reluctance, the loss of appetite, the dark shadows under his usually vibrant eyes. Most concerning were the nightmares that had Kevin waking up screaming 3 nights this week, and the bedwetting that had mysteriously returned after being resolved for nearly 2 years. John crouched beside Kevin's chair, bringing himself to his son's eye level. His face was etched with the unmistakable lines of fatherly concern. The morning light highlighted the worry lines that had begun forming around his eyes, lines that hadn't been there just a month ago. "Honey, what's wrong?" John asked softly, resting his hand on Kevin's small shoulder. "You love school. Is someone being mean to you? Are the lessons too hard?" Kevin's shoulders rose in a half-hearted shrug as he avoided his father's gaze, his eyes fixed determinately on the tabletop. "I just don't feel good," he mumbled, picking at a scratch in the wooden surface. His voice was so quiet, John had to lean closer to hear him over the ambient kitchen sounds. Sarah Thompson lowered her newspaper with a rustle, checking her watch before taking a final sip of coffee. Her crisp button-down shirt and neatly knotted tie contrasted with the casual atmosphere of the breakfast table. "We've been through this, John," she said with a barely concealed sigh. "It's just adjustment difficulties with his new teacher. Mrs. Peterson can be strict, but she's good. All the parents say so." She folded her newspaper with precise movements, tucking it under her arm. John straightened up, running a hand through his hair. "But what about the nightmares? The bedwetting that started 3 weeks ago, right after—" Sarah cut him off with a dismissive wave of her hand, already reaching for her briefcase propped against the counter. "All kids go through phases. Remember how he was afraid of the dark last year? We got him that night light, and after a week, he was fine." The finality in her tone suggested the conversation was over before it had truly begun. John pressed his lips together, holding back the words he wanted to say. This felt different. The fear of the dark had made sense. Many children experienced that. But this progressive withdrawal, this growing dread of school, it felt wrong, like a warning bell he couldn't silence. Kevin excused himself quietly, sliding off his chair with none of his usual morning energy. John watched him shuffle down the hallway toward his bedroom, his small shoulders slumped forward as if carrying an invisible weight. The morning light cast long shadows behind him as he disappeared into his room to get his backpack, and John couldn't shake the feeling that those shadows seemed to cling to him in a way that made his heart ache. He remained in the doorway, watching the empty hallway long after Kevin had gone, his paternal instincts screaming that something was wrong. He just couldn't identify what it was yet. John walked Kevin to the bus stop, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue that contrasted sharply with the anxiety radiating from his son. Other parents and children gathered at the corner, their cheerful morning chatter creating a backdrop that only emphasized Kevin's unusual silence. John glanced down, noticing Kevin's hands trembling as he clutched his red lunchbox. His face was unnaturally pale, making his freckles stand out starkly against his skin. His forehead was creased with worry lines that seemed grotesquely out of place on a 6-year-old's face. John felt his own anxiety ratcheting up a notch. "Are you cold, honey?" he asked, though he knew the autumn morning wasn't chilly enough to cause such trembling. Kevin shook his head without looking up, his eyes fixed on the sidewalk. His knuckles were white around the handle of his lunchbox. The familiar rumble of an approaching engine drew John's attention to the street. The yellow school bus rounded the corner, its bright color a cheerful contrast to the bare autumn trees lining the street. The hydraulic brakes hissed loudly as the vehicle stopped in front of the waiting families. John felt Kevin's entire body stiffen beside him. His hands suddenly clamped around John's with surprising strength, his palm clammy against his father's skin. The doors folded open with a mechanical wheeze, revealing Mr. Buford, the bus driver. He was a heavy-set man with a balding head that gleamed under the bus's interior lights. His blue uniform shirt stretched across his broad chest, a laminated name badge pinned at his pocket. "Good morning, boys and girls," Buford called out, his voice booming in the quiet morning. His round face broke into a wide smile as he greeted the children, his appearance the very picture of a friendly neighborhood bus driver. A high-pitched sound escaped Kevin's throat, startling John. He looked down just as his son erupted into hysterical crying, his face contorted instantly, tears streaming down his cheeks as he backed away from the bus door. "I don't want to go. Please, Daddy, please don't make me," Kevin screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He pulled away from John with such force that he momentarily lost his grip on him. He darted toward the bus, but stopped at the steps, clinging to the metal handrail of the entrance, his body language a confusing mix of avoidance and compliance. The other parents turned to stare, their conversations halting abruptly. John caught several exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others clearly judgmental. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up his neck as he hurried to Kevin's side. John knelt beside Kevin, placing his hands gently on his shoulders. "Kevin, honey, what's wrong?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "You need to go to school. All your friends are waiting for you inside." He wiped tears from his cheeks with his thumb, acutely aware of the audience they had attracted. Mr. Buford leaned forward in his seat, his massive frame filling the driver's area. His expression was sympathetic, almost practiced in its understanding. "This happens sometimes," he said with easy confidence. "First-grade jitters. I think I know just the thing." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out 2 brightly wrapped candies, extending them on his open palm. "Special treats for brave boys who ride my bus, and one for Mom, too, for being so patient." Buford held out one candy to Kevin, whose crying had reduced to hiccuping sobs at the sight of the colorful wrapper. The bus driver's voice shifted to a gentler tone. "I keep these for situations just like this," he explained to John with a conspiratorial wink. "Works every time." Kevin hesitated, then slowly reached for the candy, his small fingers carefully avoiding contact with Buford's large hand. His sobs quieted to occasional hiccups as he stared at the bright wrapper. "And if you get on the bus now," Buford continued in that same gentle voice, "I'll have another one waiting for you after school." "How's that sound, buddy?" John watched as Kevin's resistance visibly faded, his focus entirely captured by the candy in his hand. The abrupt change in his demeanor was almost disorienting, from terror to tentative acceptance in mere seconds. Relief flooded through John as he accepted the offered candy with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Mr. Buford. That's very kind," he said, slipping the candy into his jacket pocket. "Please call me Buford," he replied with a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been driving this route for 20 years. I know how to handle the little ones." Something in his tone, perhaps the practiced ease, perhaps the forced familiarity, made John uncomfortable, but he dismissed the feeling, attributing it to gratitude for his intervention in what could have been a much more difficult morning. Kevin reluctantly climbed the steps onto the bus, casting one last glance back at John. His eyes were still red-rimmed, holding a mixture of resignation and something else John couldn't quite identify. The doors closed with a definitive hiss, and John raised his hand in a reassuring wave as the bus pulled away. He stood watching until the bright yellow vehicle disappeared around the corner, joining the stream of morning traffic. The candy felt strangely heavy in his pocket as an uneasy feeling settled in his stomach, a feeling he tried to dismiss as lingering embarrassment from Kevin's public meltdown. John remained rooted to the spot long after the other parents had left, staring down the now empty street as if it might offer answers to the questions swirling in his mind. The weight of the candy in his pocket seemed disproportionate to its actual size, a physical manifestation of his growing discomfort. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't articulate what, even to himself. A movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention. Maria Rodriguez still stood at the corner, her gaze fixed on the distant point where the bus had disappeared. Unlike the other parents who had quickly dispersed to their daily routines, Maria seemed suspended in the moment, her expression troubled. John hesitated, then approached the woman cautiously. They had exchanged pleasantries at school events and PTA meetings, but had never really had a substantial conversation. Maria was always impeccably dressed, but today John noticed small details that seemed off: a missing earring, a coffee stain on her otherwise crisp blouse, dark circles under her eyes partially hidden by concealer. "Everything okay?" John asked, startling Maria out of her reverie. Maria turned, momentarily confused, before forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, John, right? Just thinking," she said, shifting her weight from one foot to another. She glanced at her watch, an automatic gesture that seemed more habit than necessity. "Your son, Miguel, is in Kevin's class, right?" John ventured, trying to place the quiet, dark-haired boy he'd seen at school functions. Maria nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yes, they sit at the same table. Mrs. Peterson mentioned they work well together on art projects." She glanced at her watch again, clearly preparing to end the conversation. John took a deep breath, deciding to take a chance. "Has Miguel been acting differently lately?" he asked, keeping his tone casual even as his heart beat faster at his own boldness. The effect was immediate. Maria's forced smile vanished, replaced by an expression of such raw concern that John almost took a step back. "He's been so quiet lately," Maria admitted, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "He used to be such a chatterbox. We'd joke that we couldn't get him to stop talking at dinner, but now he barely speaks, just pushes his food around." She sighed heavily, seeming relieved to finally voice her concerns. "And his grades are dropping. His teacher called me about it yesterday. He's always been good at math, but now—" She trailed off, shaking her head. John felt a chill despite the morning warmth. The similarities to Kevin's behavior were too striking to ignore. The withdrawal, the change in academic performance, the anxiety. "Does he?" John hesitated, formulating his next question carefully. "Does he ever say he doesn't want to go to school or have nightmares?" Maria's eyes widened slightly. "Both, actually. He's been having bad dreams, wakes up crying, and getting him on the bus is becoming a daily battle." She paused, studying John's face. "Why? Is Kevin going through something similar?" John offered a reassuring smile he didn't quite feel. "They're just kids growing up. Kevin throws tantrums about school, too. I think they all go through these phases," he said, trying to convince himself as much as Maria. The explanation fell hollow even as he spoke it, but he didn't know what else to say. Maria nodded quickly, seeming relieved by the simple explanation. "You're probably right. I'm overthinking things. My husband says I worry too much," she said with a self-deprecating laugh that held little humor. "He thinks I'm being paranoid, but mothers know when something's wrong, don't they?" John nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. Maria checked her watch one final time, this time with genuine concern. "I should get going. I have a meeting in 20 minutes. Thanks for the chat, John. It's good to know I'm not the only one dealing with whatever this is." "Of course," John replied. "Maybe we can get the boys together for play date sometime. Might help them both." "I'd like that," Maria said with a genuine smile, the first of their conversation. She handed John her phone, and they quickly exchanged numbers before parting ways. As John walked back to his house, his mind circled relentlessly around the coincidence. Two boys on the same bus route, same class, both suddenly afraid of school, both experiencing nightmares and regressive behaviors, and both mysteriously late to class, according to what Maria had mentioned about the teacher's call. John tried to dismiss the connections as he approached his front door, inserting his key into the lock with perhaps more force than necessary. Coincidences happened all the time, especially with children the same age going through similar developmental stages. But the weight of the candy in his pocket seemed heavier than before, a small but insistent reminder that sometimes what looks like coincidence is actually a pattern waiting to be recognized. John returned home to find Sarah preparing to leave for work, car keys jingling in her hand as she patted her pockets for her wallet and phone. The normality of the scene, his wife going through her daily routine, felt at odds with the unease churning inside him. He held up the candy Buford had given him, the bright wrapper catching the kitchen light. Kevin had another meltdown at the bus stop, he said, leaning against the kitchen counter for support he didn't realize he needed until that moment. Sarah raised an eyebrow, pausing her morning routine. Again? That's the third time this week, she sighed, running a hand through her neatly combed hair. What was it this time? Same as before. Crying, begging not to get on the bus. John placed the candy on the counter, watching as Sarah picked it up, turning it over in her hands with mild curiosity. Buford gave you this? Sarah asked, examining the wrapper. A smile spread across her face, softening her features. Good old Buford. He was driving that route when we were kids, remember? He's practically a neighborhood institution. Everyone knows him. She tossed the candy back onto the counter with casual dismissal. John watched the small, wrapped sweet bounce once before settling on the granite surface. Did you ever find him odd? He asked carefully. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. Buford? No way. He's just one of those career bus drivers, salt-of-the-earth type. He used to let us sit in the driver's seat sometimes after the route was done, show us how the doors worked. She grabbed her travel mug, taking a final sip before securing the lid. Why? Did he say something? John hesitated, unsure how to articulate his vague unease. Instead, he shifted the conversation slightly. Mrs. Peterson called yesterday. Kevin was late again. That's the fourth time this month. Sarah shrugged, grabbing her keys from the hook by the door. Probably just dawdling. You know how he gets distracted, she replied, checking her watch. Sees a bug or a cool rock, and everything else disappears from his mind. But the nightmares, Sarah, John pressed, following her toward the door. The bedwetting. And I just talked to Maria Rodriguez at the bus stop. Her son Miguel is having issues too. He's withdrawn, and his grades are dropping. Both boys ride the same bus, and both have been late to class multiple times this month. Sarah sighed, turning to face him with an expression that mixed impatience with condescension. See, it's just the age. He's not the only one going through this. First grade is an adjustment for all of them, she said dismissively. Kids go through phases. Remember how anxious you were about everything when you were little? Your mom told me all about it. You're transferring your own childhood anxieties to our son. John felt his cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. This isn't about me, he insisted, his voice rising slightly. This is about Kevin and the fact that something is clearly wrong. 6-year-olds don't just start having night terrors out of nowhere. They don't regress to bedwetting without a reason. So what are you suggesting? Sarah challenged, her own frustration evident. That the school is somehow traumatizing him? That his teacher, who comes with glowing recommendations, is secretly terrorizing the children? Or maybe it's the cafeteria food. I don't know what it is, John exclaimed, throwing his hands up. But a parent knows when something's wrong with their child, and something is definitely wrong with Kevin. Sarah checked her watch again, more pointedly this time. You treat him like he's still a toddler. He has to grow up sometime, John. First grade comes with expectations, homework, sitting still, following directions. Not every child adjusts at the same pace. First graders shouldn't have pressures that give them nightmares. John countered, his voice rising with his frustration. And it can't be a coincidence that Miguel is having problems too, both boys on the same bus route. If there are issues at school, we need to address them, not dismiss them because they're inconvenient to acknowledge. Sarah's jaw tightened as she checked her watch a third time. "I'm late. We'll talk about this tonight," she said, her tone making it clear the conversation was over. She leaned in to kiss his cheek, the gesture automatic and perfunctory, before heading out the door. The sound of her car starting up and pulling away left John in a silence that seemed to amplify his thoughts rather than quiet them. He paced the kitchen, his mind racing. Sarah's dismissal stung, but also strengthened his resolve. If she wouldn't take Kevin's behavior seriously, he would have to trust his own instincts. The candy on the counter caught his eye again, and he paused, picking it up. Why would a bus driver carry sweets for children, for situations just like this? How often did this happen? How many children had meltdowns on Buford's bus? The candy no longer seemed like a kind gesture, but something more calculated, a tool perhaps. John turned the small sweet over in his hand, his mind connecting dots he hadn't seen before. The late arrivals to school which both Kevin and Miguel experienced, the nightmares, the sudden fear of school. No, not school, he realized with growing clarity. The fear wasn't about school itself. It was about the journey to get there. Something didn't add up, and John was determined to find out what it was. John decided to take action, grabbing his purse and car keys. He couldn't ignore his instincts any longer. Something was wrong, and he needed answers. The drive to Westfield Elementary took only 10 minutes, the familiar route passing by neighborhood parks and small businesses. He rehearsed what he'd say to the principal, trying to sound concerned but not accusatory. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles turning white as he mentally sorted through the confusing pieces of Kevin's behavior, the bus driver's candy, and his conversation with Maria. He wouldn't be dismissed or patronized this time. His child's well-being was at stake. The school secretary looked up as John entered the front office, the smell of disinfectant and children's art supplies hanging in the air. "I'd like to see Principal Miller about my son, Kevin Thompson," John said, his hands fidgeting with his purse strap. The secretary nodded and made a quick call, then directed John down the hallway to a door with principal stenciled in black letters across frosted glass. The hallway walls were lined with student artwork and achievement certificates, cheerful reminders of the normal, healthy environment the school was supposed to provide. The normalcy made John doubt himself momentarily. Was he overreacting to typical childhood behavior? Principal Miller rose from behind her desk when John entered, extending her hand with a practiced smile. "Mr. Thompson, what brings you in today?" she asked, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. John sat, suddenly feeling like he was the one in trouble. "I'm concerned about Kevin," he began, outlining the bedwetting, nightmares, and his fierce resistance to the school bus. "And he's been arriving late to class. I received a call from Mrs. Peterson yesterday," John added, his voice sounding steadier than he felt, the words tumbling out with growing urgency as he recounted the signs of distress Kevin had been exhibiting. The principal's expression shifted from polite interest to slight concern. "Yes, I'm aware of Kevin's tardiness issues," she confirmed, pulling up his file on her computer. "The late arrivals have become quite regular, at least once a week for the past month." When John suggested that perhaps the school bus had been running behind schedule, Principal Miller shook her head firmly. "That's not possible, Mr. Thompson. All our buses have GPS tracking systems that monitor their exact location and arrival times. I can assure you, Bus 17 has been arriving at its scheduled time every day." She turned her computer screen to show John a log of precisely documented arrival times. The digital evidence stared back at John, undermining his theory with cold, hard data that left no room for interpretation. John felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. Without the bus to blame, Kevin's tardiness became harder to explain. I don't understand then," he stammered, suddenly questioning himself. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was just first-grade jitters, as she suggested. "Kevin used to love school," he said lamely, his earlier conviction wavering under the principal's authoritative gaze. The confidence that propelled him to the school began to crack, replaced by a creeping sense of self-doubt. He shifted in his seat, suddenly feeling like an over-anxious parent making a fuss over nothing. Principal Miller's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Thompson, adjustment difficulties are common at this age. The transition to a more structured academic environment can be challenging for some children. Her words echoed Sarah's dismissals so closely that John almost believed them. The principal continued, "We can schedule an evaluation with our school counselor if you'd like, but in my experience, these behaviors usually resolve themselves as the child adapts." Her tone was kind, but carried an undercurrent of professional authority that made John feel foolish for suggesting anything might be amiss with the bus or school procedures. John nodded woodenly, thanking the principal for her time. As he walked through the hallway toward the exit, he felt deflated, his paternal instincts warring with the logical explanations he'd been given. The school felt normal, with children's laughter echoing from classrooms and colorful artwork lining the walls. He began to doubt himself. Was he being overprotective, making mountains out of molehills, as Sarah suggested? The sounds of a functioning elementary school surrounded him. A teacher's voice leading a reading lesson, the clatter of chairs in a classroom, the squeak of the custodian's cart on the polished floor. Nothing seemed out of place. As John pushed through the front doors into the bright midday sun, movement in the parking lot caught his eye. Children were filing out of the school toward the playground for lunch recess, teachers monitoring their lines through the chain-link fence. Something made him pause. A heavy-set man in a blue shirt was holding a small boy's hand, leading him not toward the playground but away from the school grounds. The child's bright red polo shirt and sandy blonde hair were unmistakable, even from this distance. He only caught a brief glimpse for a moment before they disappeared around a corner, but his heart recognized what his mind could barely process. Kevin, his son, and the man that brought back the distinct gait looked unmistakably like Buford. John froze mid-step, his breath catching in his throat as paternal recognition overrode all rational thought. His son, who should have been in class, was leaving school grounds with Buford, the bus driver who had no business being at the school during the middle of the day. He jumped into action, sprinting across the school's front lawn toward the corner where they disappeared. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat accompanied by a silent plea. "Please let me be wrong. Please let it be someone else." The gravel crunched under his feet as he ran, his purse slapping against his hip with each desperate stride. As he rounded the corner, breathless from both exertion and fear, John saw a yellow school bus pulling away from a side entrance he hadn't noticed before. The brake lights flashed briefly as the vehicle accelerated, turning onto the service road that ran behind the school. Without hesitation, John sprinted to his car, fumbling with his keys as he slid behind the wheel. His hands trembled so violently he had to make 2 attempts to insert the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he pulled out of the parking space with a screech of tires, drawing startled looks from teachers supervising the playground nearby. John kept his eyes fixed on the yellow bus, now turning onto the service road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Every paternal instinct screamed that his son was in danger, and nothing else mattered but reaching him in time. The service road was narrow and poorly maintained, with potholes and gravel sections that made John's car bounce and rattle as he followed at what he hoped was a discreet distance. Dust rose from the bus's tires, creating a hazy trail that made it difficult to see at times. The road curved through a sparse grove of trees, the branches occasionally scraping against the sides of his car as he navigated the tight passage. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 2 minutes, the road opened to a small clearing where a white camper van with gray stripes sat parked. The vehicle looked weathered but well-maintained, partially concealed from the main road by the surrounding trees. The bus pulled alongside the camper and stopped, its engine still running. John quickly parked his car behind a cluster of trees about 50 yards away, cutting the engine and sitting in horrified silence as he watched the scene unfold through his windshield. The bus door opened with a hydraulic hiss that he could almost hear despite the distance. Buford stepped off the bus, his large frame unmistakable even from this far away. Behind him, looking small and vulnerable, came Kevin. John's breath caught in his throat as he watched Buford lead his son by the hand toward the camper door. Kevin's posture was stiff, his steps reluctant, as Buford's large hand engulfed his small one. John felt his entire body go cold as they climbed the metal steps into the camper. The door closed behind them with a finality that sent ice through his veins. John's mind raced with terrible possibilities as he stared at the white camper, now containing his son and a man he trusted simply because he'd been a fixture in the community. Why would the bus driver bring Kevin to this isolated location during school hours? What could possibly be happening behind that closed door? His hands shook as he pulled his phone for his purse and dialed 911, nearly dropping the device in his haste. Each ring seemed to last an eternity before a calm, professional voice answered. "Emergency services. What's your emergency?" "I need help." John gasped into the phone, his voice breaking with fear and urgency. "My son, I think he's been kidnapped. The school bus driver took him from school. I followed them. They're in some kind of camper van now. Please, you have to hurry." The dispatcher's voice remained steady, a stabilizing force amid John's panic. "Sir, I need you to take a deep breath and tell me your name and location." John forced himself to inhale. "My name is John Thompson. I'm on some kind of service road behind Westfield Elementary School. There's a yellow school bus parked next to a white camper van with gray stripes. My son, Kevin, is in there with the bus driver, and he shouldn't be." "How old is your son, Mr. Thompson?" "6. He's only 6 years old," John replied, his voice catching. "The bus driver is a man named Buford. I watched him take Kevin off the bus and into the camper. This isn't normal. This isn't right." The dispatcher continued asking questions, trying to guide John through his fragmented responses, extracting crucial details from his panicked account. "Officers are being dispatched to your location right now, Mr. Thompson. Are you in a safe place? Can you be seen from the camper or the bus?" "I'm parked behind some trees. I don't think they can see me," John said, his eyes never leaving the camper door. "Please tell them to hurry. I don't know what's happening in there. The officers are on their way, but I need you to stay on the line with me. More importantly, I need you to stay in your vehicle. Do not approach the camper or the bus. Do you understand? This could be a dangerous situation, and we need you to remain safe until help arrives." John mumbled agreement, though every paternal instinct screamed at him to run to the camper and get his son. The dispatcher continued speaking soothingly, asking about Kevin, about what John had observed, about any other details he could provide. Each second felt like an eternity as John watched the silent camper, imagining what might be happening inside. Then he heard it, Kevin's voice, frightened and high-pitched, carrying faintly through the thin walls of the camper. The sound sent a chill down John's spine. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear. "I can hear my son," John said, cutting off the dispatcher mid-sentence. "He sounds scared. I can hear him through the walls. Mr. Thompson, the officers are just minutes away. Please stay in your—" But John had already dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, paternal instinct overriding all caution and reason. He flung open his car door and ran toward the camper, his footsteps crunching on the gravel of the service road. His heart pounded in his chest, blood rushing in his ears as he approached the vehicle containing his son. Without hesitation, John pounded on the camper door with his fist, making the entire vehicle shake with the force of his fury and fear. "Buford, open this door right now," he demanded, his voice stronger and steadier than he felt. There was a moment of absolute silence, then shuffling sound from inside the camper, drawers closing, whispered words he couldn't quite make out. The door swung open suddenly, revealing a startled Buford, his heavy-set frame filling the narrow doorway. His shirt was untucked on one side, his face flushed with what might have been surprise or something else entirely. "Mr. Thompson," he exclaimed, his eyebrows rising in apparent shock. "What are you doing here?" He attempted to block his view inside with his body, shifting to stand more firmly in the doorway. "Where's my son?" John demanded, trying to see past Buford's substantial frame. "Now, Mr. Thompson, there's been a misunderstanding," Buford began, his voice taking on a placating tone that only fueled John's fury. John pushed past him with a strength he didn't know he possessed, the adrenaline of paternal protection giving him the force needed to move the much larger man aside. He gasped when he saw Kevin sitting on a small bench built into the wall of the camper. Tears streamed down his face, his bright red polo shirt rumpled and untucked. His expression when he saw his father was a mixture of relief and shame that broke John's heart. "Kevin, come here right now," he called, arms outstretched toward his son. Kevin bolted from the bench and ran to him, wrapping his arms around his father's waist and sobbing into his shirt. The smell of his shampoo, the apple-scented one he'd picked himself at the grocery store last week, mingled with something sickly sweet in the camper. John's eyes darted around the small space, taking in details with the heightened awareness of fear. Candy wrappers littered a small table. A digital camera sat on a shelf above what looked like a narrow bed. Curtains were drawn across the camper windows, blocking outside light. Buford raised his hands defensively, stepping between John and the door to prevent their exit. "This isn't what it looks like," he insisted, his voice steady but his eyes darting nervously between John and the service road outside. "Kevin wasn't feeling well. I was just helping him out. I was going to take him back to school as soon as he felt better." "Move away from the door," John commanded, one arm wrapped protectively around Kevin, the other reaching for his phone, which he realized too late was still in his car. "Mr. Thompson, you're overreacting," Buford said, his voice taking on an edge. "This is a simple misunderstanding. I've been driving kids for 20 years. Parents trust me." John was preparing to physically fight his way past Buford when he heard voices approaching outside, firm, authoritative voices calling commands. Relief flooded through him as he recognized what the voices meant. The 911 dispatcher had acted quickly. 2 police officers appeared at the edge of the trees, weapons drawn as they advanced cautiously toward the camper. "Police, step away from the door," an officer commanded, moving steadily closer. Buford's face drained of color as he saw them, his hands slowly rising above his head as he moved away from John and Kevin. More sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the approach of additional units. John clutched Kevin to his side, his body positioned between him and Buford as the officers reached the camper steps. One officer kept his weapon trained on Buford, while the other approached John. "Sir, are you and the boy all right?" the officer asked, his eyes quickly scanning them for visible injuries. John nodded, unable to form words past the lump in his throat. Kevin pressed his face harder against his father's side, his small body still trembling with silent sobs. "Take them both out of here," the first officer instructed his partner, never taking his eyes off Buford. "Get them to safety while we secure the scene." As the second officer gently guided John and Kevin away from the camper, John felt his knees weaken with relief and delayed shock. They had found Kevin in time. But what exactly had they interrupted, and how long had it been going on? "This is all a misunderstanding," Buford protested loudly as an officer approached him with handcuffs ready. "I was helping a boy. He wasn't feeling well at school. Ask him yourself." Despite his protests, his face had taken on a sickly pallor, beads of sweat forming on his forehead as the officer firmly guided his hands behind his back. John stood on the gravel road, holding Kevin so tightly against him that he could feel his rapid heartbeat against his side. He positioned himself as a physical barrier between his son and Buford, watching with grim satisfaction as the officer secured the handcuffs with a definitive click. More police vehicles arrived, their lights reflecting off the white surface of the camper in blue and red flashes. Officers emerged, some setting up a perimeter around the area, others approaching the camper with purposeful steps. John recognized a detective badge on an approaching officer, a middle-aged woman with short dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. The female officer knelt down to Kevin's level, her movement deliberate and non-threatening. "Hi there," she said, her voice gentle but not condescending. "My name is Officer Davis. What's your name?" Kevin pressed himself harder against John, his face half hidden in the fabric of his shirt. "Kevin," he whispered, the word barely audible. Officer Davis nodded, maintaining a respectful distance. "Kevin, that's a great name. Can you tell me what happened today? Why were you in this camper with Mr. Buford?" Kevin stared at his shoes, his small body trembling visibly against John. The silence stretched for several seconds, broken only by the crackle of police radios and the distant sound of birds in the trees. John held his breath, unsure if Kevin would speak at all. When he finally did, his voice was so quiet that John and Officer Davis had to lean closer to hear him. "He wanted to take pictures of me without my shirt," Kevin whispered, the words tumbling out as if he'd held them inside too long. "He does it every time he takes me from school. He said the candies were special, and I had to pay him back by keeping secrets." John felt his knees weaken as Kevin continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "He said if I told anyone, they'd think I was a bad boy and no one would love me anymore. That's why I couldn't tell you, Daddy. I didn't want you to stop loving me." Officer Davis's expression remained professionally neutral, but John caught the flicker of controlled anger in her eyes as she exchanged a knowing glance with her colleagues. The officer's voice betrayed none of this emotion when she spoke again to Kevin, keeping her tone reassuring. "Kevin, you did nothing wrong, nothing at all, and your dad still loves you very much. I can tell just by the way he's holding you right now." Across the clearing, Buford's protest grew louder as another officer read him his rights. "This is preposterous," he shouted, struggling against the restraints. "I've been driving for this district for 20 years. Everyone knows me. You can't seriously believe I would harm a child." His face had turned from pale to mottled red, spittle flying from his mouth as he shouted. John turned Kevin away from the sight, shielding him from Buford's increasingly desperate protests. The bus driver continued shouting as officers led him to a patrol car, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I was helping him. He wasn't feeling well. This is a mistake." Officer Davis stood, nodding to a colleague who approached with a gentle smile. "Mr. Thompson, Officer Chun is going to take you and Kevin to a separate patrol car. We need to get both of you away from here." As Officer Chun guided them toward a waiting police vehicle, John glanced back at the camper. Other officers were donning latex gloves, preparing to enter the vehicle. The methodical, practiced way they moved told John this wasn't their first time handling such a scene. The realization made his stomach clench with nausea. Through the open door of the camper, John glimpsed an officer emerging with something in his gloved hand. He spoke quietly to a colleague, his expression grim as he held up what appeared to be a digital camera. Another officer brought out what looked like a school backpack, not Kevin's, which was still presumably at school. The backpack was smaller, with a cartoon character John didn't recognize. His mind reeled with the implications. "Mr. Thompson, please," Officer Chin said gently, guiding his attention away from the scene. "Let's get you and Kevin somewhere quiet." John nodded numbly, helping Kevin into the back seat of the patrol car. His body was still trembling, though less violently now. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline crash leaving him pale and drained. Officer Davis approached the car window, her expression serious but kind. "We're going to need both of you to come to the station for formal statements," she explained. "It's important we document everything while the details are fresh, especially for Kevin." John nodded, struggling to process everything happening around them. "Of course," he managed, "whatever you need." As Officer Davis turned to speak with a colleague, Kevin looked up at John with red-rimmed eyes. "Can we go home now?" he asked, his voice small and tired. "I want to go home." John brushed his hair back from his forehead, his heart breaking at the simple request he couldn't yet fulfill. "Soon, baby. We need to help the police first. Then we'll go home. I promise." The patrol car pulled away from the scene, tires crunching on gravel as they turned onto the service road. Through the rear window, John could see more officers arriving, evidence technicians setting up equipment near the camper. The school bus, that familiar yellow vehicle that should have represented safety, now looked ominous, surrounded by police vehicles, its lights flashing silently in the growing chaos. John held Kevin close as they drove away, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. How long had this been happening? How many other children had Buford targeted? And how had all of them, missed the signs for so long? The ride to the police station seemed endless, each turn and traffic signal stretching time in a way that made minutes feel like hours. John kept his arm wrapped protectively around Kevin's shoulders, occasionally murmuring reassurances when he felt him tense beside him. The police officer driving them, Officer Chun, maintained a respectful silence, glancing at them in the rearview mirror with understanding eyes. At the station, they were led to a small interview room with beige walls and institutional furniture that attempted comfort but achieved only functionality. A box of tissues sat on the table alongside a pitcher of water and plastic cups. Kevin refused to leave John's side, climbing onto his lap as soon as he sat down in one of the padded chairs. A social worker named Ms. Jenkins joined them, her gentle demeanor and soft voice clearly practiced for situations involving traumatized children. She explained to Kevin that they would need to ask him some questions, but he could take breaks whenever he needed, and his dad would stay with him the whole time. While they waited for the detective, John called Sarah, his voice breaking as he explained what had happened. Her initial disbelief came through clearly in her shocked silence. "What do you mean Buford took him to a camper?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with each word. "That doesn't make any sense. Buford's been driving buses forever. Everyone knows him." "Sarah, I saw it with my own eyes," John replied, his voice steadier than he expected. "I followed them. Kevin was in that camper with him. The police have arrested Buford, and they're gathering evidence right now." There was a long pause before Sarah spoke again, her voice smaller now. "John, I didn't believe you this morning. I dismissed everything you were worried about." "I know," John said simply, too emotionally drained for anger or accusations. "I'm on my way," Sarah said, guilt evident in her voice. "I'll be there as soon as I can." After ending the call, John sat quietly with Kevin, stroking his hair as the social worker prepared some drawing materials for him. Kevin's shoulders gradually relaxed under John's touch, though his eyes remained weary. Each time the door opened, the school principal, Principal Miller, arrived at the station, looking visibly shaken. Her normally impeccable appearance was marred by worry lines and hastily applied lipstick. Detective Miller, who introduced herself as the lead investigator, brought her into the room where John waited. "This is impossible," Principal Miller told the detective, shaking her head in disbelief. "All our buses have GPS tracking. We would have known if the bus wasn't on its designated route. The system alerts us if a bus stops anywhere unexpected for more than 3 minutes." Detective Miller shook her head grimly, consulting the notes on her tablet. "Buford tampered with the GPS unit on his bus," she explained. "Our tech team did a preliminary examination. He installed a simple electronic switch that let him temporarily disable the GPS signal while keeping the unit in place." Principal Miller's face paled as Miller continued. "The system would still show the bus at its last reported location, making it appear stationary at a school or designated stop. He'd then reconnect before returning to his normal route." The detective's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes reflected disgust at the calculated nature of the deception. "We never would have caught it without a physical inspection of the unit," she added. "It was professionally installed, hidden behind the dashboard panel. This wasn't amateur work." Principal Miller glanced at John, her shoulders slumped with defeat, her eyes quickly dropping to the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the parent whose concerns she had so easily dismissed. "How long?" John asked Detective Miller, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long has he been doing this?" Detective Miller exchanged a glance with the social worker before answering carefully. "We're still early in the investigation, Mr. Thompson, but based on what we found so far, this has been going on for some time, possibly years." The detective turned her tablet screen toward John and the principal, showing school attendance records for Kevin and several other children. "Your son wasn't just being taken during lunch breaks," she explained gently. "Buford would sometimes keep Kevin and other children on the bus during morning drop-offs, drive to the camper, and then deliver them to school late." John studied the screen, recognizing a pattern he should have seen weeks ago. The late arrivals recorded in the school system matched exactly with the days when Kevin's anxiety had been at its worst. The children were instructed to tell their teachers they were late for various innocuous reasons: doctor's appointments, traffic, oversleeping, Miller continued. Given their ages, the teachers had no reason to question these explanations, especially since the tardiness was intermittent rather than daily and spread across different children. John's hands trembled as he processed this information. All those mornings when Kevin had begged not to go to school, all those late arrivals, she had completely missed what was happening. What about the other children? Principal Miller asked, her professional composure cracking. How many are we talking about? We're still compiling a list, Miller replied. We're cross-referencing the bus route with tardiness records and behavioral reports from teachers. Right now, we're looking at potentially 8 to 10 children, but that number may change as we investigate further. As John sat processing this information, the station door burst open and Maria Rodriguez rushed in with her son, Miguel, clinging to her hand. Maria's face was pale with panic, her normally tidy hair escaping its ponytail in disarray. She froze when she spotted John across the room, recognition and horror dawning in her eyes simultaneously. I heard what happened, she said, her voice trembling as she approached. A parent from the bus route called me, and I remember our conversation this morning. She pulled Miguel closer to her side, the boy's eyes downcast and shoulders hunched in a posture John now recognized all too well. After I got the call, I sat down with Miguel and asked him some careful questions. He broke down crying and told me about what Buford had been doing. Miguel, a small boy with dark curly hair and solemn eyes, clung to his mother, nodding silently to confirm her words. Detective Miller's expression hardened with grim determination as she quickly arranged for another interview room and social worker, knowing each new victim would strengthen their case against Buford. As the evening progressed, the police station filled with more concerned parents from the same bus route. Each family arrived with the same shocked expression, the same questions, and increasingly, the same horrible confirmations from their children. John watched through the interview room window as families arrived, feeling a mixture of relief that Kevin wasn't the only victim and profound sadness for the same reason. The detective returned to John, his expression grim but satisfied with the evidence. With the evidence we've collected and multiple victims already coming forward, Buford is looking at decades behind bars, she explained, keeping her voice low. Cases like these carry heavy sentences, especially with the premeditation we've uncovered. She glanced at Kevin, who sat quietly on a nearby chair with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, then back to John. You did this, she told him quietly, respect evident in her tone. Your instinct to follow that bus likely saved more than just your son today. John nodded, too emotionally drained to feel any satisfaction from the praise. He had saved Kevin today, but where had his instincts been all the other days when he'd been suffering in silence? Detective Miller finished debriefing John, her weathered face showing both exhaustion and determination after hours of coordinating the rapidly expanding investigation. She closed her notebook with a soft snap, tucking it into her jacket pocket. Mr. Thompson, because of your actions today, we've already identified 4 other children affected by Buford's predatory behavior. There will likely be more, she said, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private despite the bustling activity of the station. John nodded silently, his gaze drifting to the interview room where Kevin sat with a child psychologist. Through the window, he could see him hunched over a coloring book, his small hand gripping a crayon with such intensity that his knuckles were white. His face was set in a concentration that seemed out of place on a 6-year-old, too serious, too burdened. We're obtaining search warrants for Buford's home, the detective continued, her voice even lower now. Based on what we found in the camper, we suspect this has been going on for, she paused, clearly weighing her words carefully, a very long time. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. John swallowed hard, fighting back a fresh wave of nausea at the thought of how many children might have been victimized over Buford's 20 years as a bus driver. A woman in her mid-40s approached them, her sensible bob framing a face lined with experience rather than age. She wore a navy blue blazer over a simple blouse, a lanyard with an ID badge hanging around her neck. Her eyes were kind but assessing as she extended her hand to John. Mr. Thompson, I'm Dr. Renee Carter from Child Protective Services. I'll be the lead case manager for Kevin and the other children involved. Her handshake was firm, professional, but not without warmth. John returned the handshake automatically, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization that this was just the beginning of a long process. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "What comes next?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, needing to know, "Will my son ever be okay again?" The tremble in his voice betrayed the fear he'd been suppressing for hours. Dr. Carter glanced around the crowded station, then gently guided John to a more private corner of the waiting area, away from the constant movement of officers and distraught parents. They sat on molded plastic chairs bolted to the floor, an island of relative calm in the chaos. "Children are remarkably resilient, Mr. Thompson," Dr. Carter said, her tone professional yet warm, a balance earned through years of walking families through their darkest moments. "Kevin will need therapy, both individual sessions and eventually some group work with other children when the time is right. There will be good days and difficult ones." John watched through the glass as Kevin showed his drawing to the psychologist, pointing to something on the paper with serious focus. From this distance, he couldn't see what he'd drawn, but the psychologist's gentle nod seemed encouraging. "The most important thing right now," Dr. Carter continued, following John's gaze, "is that you found him. You believed him when he didn't even have the words to tell you what was happening. Many children in these situations never get that." John turned back to Dr. Carter, tears threatening to spill over. "But I didn't know what was happening," he admitted, the guilt he'd been holding back finally breaking through. "I knew something was wrong, but I had no idea it was this." Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly, her eyes direct and honest. "You know, many children in these situations are never discovered. The predators count on children staying silent through manipulation and fear. They count on parents dismissing behavioral changes, on schools missing the patterns. But you didn't dismiss the changes in Kevin. You followed your instincts, despite being told you were overreacting." Before John could respond, the station door opened and Sarah arrived, her face ashen and eyes red-rimmed. She scanned the room frantically until she spotted John, then rushed to his side. "Where is he? Where's Kevin?" she asked, her voice rough with emotion. John pointed to the interview room, and Sarah's posture sagged with visible relief when she saw their son, safe and seemingly calm. She ran a hand through her hair, which was uncharacteristically disheveled. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Carter interrupted gently, standing to introduce herself. "I'm Dr. Carter from CPS. Your son is with one of our child psychologists right now. They're just finishing up some preliminary assessment work to help us understand what Kevin needs going forward." Sarah shook her hand distractedly, her eyes continually drawn back to the interview room. "Can I see him? Can we take him home tonight?" "Yes, to both," Dr. Carter assured her. "The psychologist will bring him out shortly, and Detective Miller has already told me you're free to take Kevin home once the paperwork is finished. We'll be scheduling follow-up appointments starting tomorrow." The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and gentle questioning. Detective Miller returned periodically with updates on the investigation, which was expanding rapidly as more officers were assigned to the case. Dr. Carter explained the support services available to Kevin and their family, including counseling options and victim advocacy programs. John felt physically and emotionally drained as he signed form after form, his handwriting growing progressively shakier. Kevin remained with his mother, barely letting go of her hand as they answered a few final, carefully worded questions from another officer. When Detective Miller finally confirmed they could take Kevin home, John felt a rush of relief wash over him. "We'll need to speak with Kevin again tomorrow," she explained, handing John her card. "But for now, take him home and try to maintain as normal a routine as possible. Familiar surroundings and regular activities will help him feel secure again." John nodded gratefully, tucking the card into his purse alongside the business card from Dr. Carter and the victim advocate. Sarah lifted an exhausted Kevin into her arms, the boy's head resting heavily on his mother's shoulder. John gathered their belongings, his movements mechanical as fatigue settled deep into his muscles. The drive home was silent, streetlights casting rhythmic patterns of light and shadow across their faces. John turned in his seat occasionally to check on Kevin, who had fallen asleep almost immediately after Sarah had buckled him into his booster seat. His face looked peaceful in sleep, the worry lines that had aged him beyond his years temporarily smoothed away. As they pulled into their driveway, John recalled the candy still sitting on their kitchen counter from this morning, a small, innocent-looking wrapper that had been the first tangible sign of something sinister. A lifetime seemed to have passed since he put it there, questioning but uncertain. He made a silent promise to always trust his instincts where his child was concerned, to never again ignore the subtle signs that something was wrong. Behind them, more police cars headed toward the school, their lights flashing silently in the growing darkness as the true scope of what Buford had done began to unfold. In the back seat, Kevin stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open for a moment. "Daddy," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Are we home?" "Yes, baby," John replied softly, reaching back to touch his knee. "We're home, and you're safe now." As Sarah carried their sleeping son into the house, John paused on the front porch, looking back at the quiet street where the bus had stopped this morning. The neighborhood looked exactly the same, peaceful, ordinary, safe. But everything had changed. The journey ahead would not be easy, but they would face it together, one step at a time. And he would never again silence the voice inside him that recognized when something was wrong with his child, no matter who told him he was overreacting. Thank you for reading this story. If you found it compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel for more stories of courage and resilience.